Hi, my name is Jayreid. I'm a psychotherapist in San Francisco, California. And today I want to talk about the importance of asking the question, did I feel loved by my narcissistic abuser? And I wanted to address this because oftentimes in the course of narcissistic abuse, the narcissistic person can insist that they actually love the survivor very, very much. Um, and that can become very, very confusing for the survivor at the time because um, they're being told by this person who often, particularly if it's a parent, has a lot of authority in the relationship to kind of dictate to the child what is real. And in that case, if the child's being told, this is love, I am loving you, but the child feels something very, very different, like I don't feel loved, or I feel like I must experience myself as less than or defective in order to be in relationship to the parent. Again, the child wouldn't be thinking these explicit thoughts, but that can be the feel of the relationship. So it's a heck of a thing to try to make sense of for the kid. Am I being loved and I just have a problem with taking it in or accepting it? And or are they trying their best to love me, but I'm somehow um, impossible to love due to my defects, as it were, that are often the defects being one is being told they have by the narcissistic abuser. And I've actually been taught this by some wonderful clients I've had the privilege to work with, where they've actually kind of rephrased it for themselves of not so much did the narcissistic abuser, were they right? Did they in fact love me? And they shifted it to asking, well, did I feel loved by that person? And typically, when they framed it that way, they knew at a very instinctual level that the answer was no, that they didn't feel loved. And that, I guess, I want to emphasize in today's video is really important to try to identify how one felt to themselves in relationship to the parent or partner who may have been the narcissistic abuser, as a way to really resolve what can be a lot of lingering ambivalence or self-doubt about, wait, like, was I really narcissistically abused? Am I just being too sensitive? Am I kind of making mountains out of molehills and the like? Not to sort, because in a way that debate is a really hard one to win with oneself. But I think it can be a very helpful paradigm shift to just simply sort of turn and say, wait, did I feel loved? And the answer to that can be a lot more viscerally apparent to the survivor. So I'm going to get into that and explore it a little bit further. But one thing I just want to talk about briefly again is the recently released course on recovery from narcissistic abuse. In the forthcoming weeks, I'd like to go through just one piece of the 8 sections in the course, just to give people a kind of flavor of what the course offers, and for you to determine whether you think it might be something that can be helpful to you. Okay, so here's the course landing page that kind of gives you a description of what it is, and talks about the 3-pronged strategy for recovery. And in the first video, which is just the introduction, it's around 20 minutes or so, it's really kind of going through those 3 prongs of recovery from narcissistic abuse, including making sense of what happened, gaining distance from the narcissistic abuser, and the distance can be emotional, psychological, often physical distance too. And then third, living in defiance of the narcissist rules. And in this section of the course, I just go into what each of those facets of recovery kind of entails. Also, the importance of each of these components being kind of equally weighted. And that is that as important as it is to make sense of what happened, one doesn't also want to lose sight of the importance of gaining and maintaining distance from the narcissistic abuser and people like them in one's life, while also working to live in defiance of the narcissist rules. So, for instance, doing things that involve prioritizing one's self-care, working to kind of develop a good relationship sort of a compassion first relationship with oneself. That all those things need to kind of work in tandem because they all kind of complement one another in the survivor's recovery efforts. And there's I would say, somewhat of a risk of kind of over-indexing on one piece to the exclusion of the others that can inadvertently make the recovery process sometimes a little more difficult or feel a little stuck at times. But that's all discussed in this video. Okay, with that, let's get back to this week's video. So what often happens in the course of narcissistic abuse is that one does not often feel loved by their narcissistic abuser. And this is not, this conclusion is not always arrived at right away. Often in treatment, at the outset, a client may say, I'm sure my parents loved me. They fed me, they clothed me. A lot of people had it worse off. And at some point, in our work together, I may ask, did you feel loved? Irrespective of what was claimed and stated towards you, did you feel loved by this parent or parents? And sometimes that question is met with a pause or self-recrimination for being, too sensitive to say, look past the occasional bouts of emotional, verbal, or physical abuse. But where we often arrive at is that although the parent claimed to have loved the person, the survivor, up and down, the survivor did not have the experience of feeling loved by that parent. And often in parallel, the survivor may feel a sense of guilt for finding it hard to access genuine feelings of love towards that narcissistic parent. Sort of like, what's wrong with me as a child that I don't feel love towards this parent? It can often create this sort of dreadful sense of guilt, and also sense of, depending on how it's made sense of, it can create a sense of, there must be something wrong with me. I'm defective. I can't even love this parent who professes to love me so much. And I want to, the purpose of today's video is to openly discuss these two outcomes of narcissistic abuse, of not feeling loved, but being told you're loved, and then also having difficulty loving that person who's in fact abusing you, because one thinks you're supposed to love your parent, and that's kind of in our culture. And then hopefully offer some tactics for affording some compassion towards yourself, for feeling whatever it is you felt in relationship to your narcissistic parent or partner, and knowing that is not a reflection of some sort of defect in you, but a product of the way you were being treated and often deprived in that relationship. So often in a narcissistic family, for the survivor, growing up, there's a duality that gets lived with. The narcissistic parent can be in a good mood and look smilingly upon those in the home, and or is out in public and sort of constantly trying to curate an impression towards the outside of being a kind and generous person. And that may come along in these situations when they're kind of upbeat for whatever reason in their orbit, with them kind of professing to the survivor, how much they love that person. And then at other times, as is often known too well by survivors, that same parent doesn't feel sufficiently complied with in their feeling of entitlement that others reflect their artificially inflated sense of self-worth. And when that happens, they can grow rageful, contemptuous, abusive, and often even hateful. And then once those sort of storms of kind of narcissistic rage and contempt pass, that the narcissistic parent may profess again how much they love the scapegoated child in this instance. And often, though, in those cases, that professing of love is often more of a manipulation to appeal to the child's hope that child is actually loved by the narcissistic parent, so that the child doesn't expose the secret about what's happening behind the closed doors in the home. That in essence doesn't puncture the sort of facade that the narcissistic parent needs to project about who they are to the outside world. So I guess what I'm saying is that typically, or a lot of times in child growing up in a narcissistic household, there's a lot of confusing messages of, on the one hand, being told he or she is loved, on the other hand, being treated like someone who is completely undeserving of love or too defective to be loved. And then, after all that happens, being told once again, oh, by the parent, I love you. It can be crazy making. Like, wait, I hear the words "I love you." I feel something like I'm being hated, and then I'm being told I love you again. So, what gives? I mean, to put it mildly. Um, and when the child's in the midst of this, I think the solution is often necessarily to dissociate from the bad times when the narcissistic storm hits mom or dad, and then to more consciously remember the good times, the times when mom or dad is facing the public or is, for whatever reason, in a good mood and being charming and charismatic to other members in the family, maybe even to you as the survivor in that moment. This is a sort of kind of forced information processing that can be done in the mind. I think as humans, we're capable of such dramatic feats of manipulation with thought, much less so with bodily experience. So like in this case, the child can necessarily insist to themselves in thought, I am being loved, even though their bodily experience feels something like, I feel loathsome. But it's the mind that can insist, no, I'm being loved. And so the mind can be very flexible in this regard. But since the bodily experience is going to argue otherwise, it needs to be kind of disconnected from to insist on this sort of conclusion of I am being loved. But nonetheless, what typically happens is that as this duality gets sort of enforced in the sake of survival for the kid, and certainly by the narcissistic parent, the child and survivor still often has a nagging sense that something's not quite right. And it's that nagging sense that often gets boiled down to this question of whether you, the survivor, actually felt, and by felt, I really want to emphasize your bodily experience, felt loved by this narcissistic parent. And I think this question is so powerful because it strips away all the professions of love made by the narcissistic parent and drills into whether any of those statements matched how you, the survivor, felt. And of course, I think everyone needs to come to their own answer in their own time. But I want to offer that if the answer is no, I did not feel loved, or not very often, then that may very well say something important about your parent as opposed to you. So, for example, there's someone who had a narcissistic parent, a mother, who was fairly exquisite at curating an impression of being magnanimous and kind and caring towards people out in the community. And the survivor knew quite differently that what would happen when they, say, came home from school, and typically would get yelled at some point between coming home and going to bed. And it would be a very, very intense, cruel bout of yelling, and the survivor's character would be attacked and be told they were lazy, inconsiderate, and so forth. But nonetheless, outside of those bouts of yelling, the survivor would be told they were loved. After the bouts, they would be told they were loved. And so it created this, again, that profound duality that where the yelling bouts had to be forgotten in a way or explained away as being deserved, and that the real parent is the one who expresses the love, I guess, verbally. And so in any case, this parent actually died when the survivor was around 21. And the survivor at the time did not know that they had survived a narcissistically abusive parent. But what they did notice is that they had no sadness at that parent's bout with sickness and then eventual funeral. And really at the time thought there was something wrong with them, that, oh, I must not be able to love people who so clearly love me. And, it wasn't until the person arrived in treatment that, that reaction got made sense of. And in a very relieving way for the survivor, grew to be understood as not something that reflected a lack of capacity to love, but just a natural reaction of not feeling loved in the first place by this narcissistic parent. And then having difficulty loving someone who didn't love the survivor, especially as a child when that person happened to be their parent. So I guess I want to offer that example to just illustrate how powerful the insistence that one is loved when in the throes of narcissistic abuse can be. And, that there's this often, again, incremental and over time sort of enlightening kind of conclusion that if one didn't feel loved, then it's going to be very difficult to love that same person. And that's not something reflective of anything deficient in the survivor, but in the circumstances they were thrust in. And so I want to offer, what's the import of this question today? Well, did I feel loved by the narcissistic parent or partner? And I think that it can be a really useful question to resolve some of the ambivalence that is so often present when trying to create distance between oneself and one's narcissistic abuser. Because even if one feels convinced that, back to the original situation when one was, as a child, dependent on the same person who was mistreating them, that there's still at that time a necessity to stay attached to that person, come hell or high water. And once one is, grown and into adulthood, one now has oneself to attach to in lieu of the parent. And I know that can sound sort of just like words, like, oh, well, one has oneself to attach to. And I've talked about that in other videos and don't want to be too glib with that statement, but it is also fundamentally true. And so if one is feeling that ambivalence of should I put distance, that, sort of like, well, maybe they did love me and that matters. And then, again, you pose the question of, well, did I feel loved? And if that answer is a resounding no, or not very often, there may be another kind of signal of like, still like, yikes, like I'm not supposed to separate from that parent because that's what would have spelled doom before. Again, I'm saying one system may say that. And that's where it can be really helpful to kind of, again, doing whatever the kind of self-care activities or grounding activities, connecting to one's breath, can be useful to kind of come in and say, okay, I have myself now. And that's, again, a practice thing over time that lets the system know, hey, it's okay to detach from people who, where I feel unwanted and where things don't work. And lastly, that, if there's often self-doubts about, should I be putting distance between myself and the narcissistic abuser? This question, I think, can help to just sort of shift to say, well, look, I'm putting distance between myself and someone whom I didn't feel loved by. And so, back to the kind of who's safe in my life versus who's not, I mean, that's kind of a striking conclusion to come to that maybe says maybe they're not so safe to be in close relationship to. Well, I hope today's video was of some use in kind of thinking through, what you deserve in relationship to people, and how, how this question of did I feel love might be helpful in coming to terms with what was offered and not offered in relationship to a narcissistically abusive parent or partner. Well, thank you again for your continued support of the channel, of this content. Again, it means so much to hear that this has been helpful to many of you, and to, again, see each other supporting one another in the discussion threads. And yeah, I look forward to posting again next week at 9 a.m. Pacific time, Sunday.